Saul Steinberg said that what we respect in the artist is always their battle against their limitations. That should be liberating. The very thing that you struggle with in your life will be the thing that leads to some of your best work. People think that authors write books because they know all this stuff. And I think that for me personally, I write books about what I struggle with. That's why they are what they are.
I study the patterns of the universe.
Masters to the brain.
Virtual your mind. Talking about your life. Fundamental principles.
Philosophy.
What is and what is not true.
Those who know themselves.
Being better every single day.
Hello there, and welcome back to another episode of the Think Grow podcast, where personal development meets real life. I'm your host, Ruben Chavez, and I explore a variety of topics with thought leaders, creators, scientists, artists, entrepreneurs, researchers, all sorts of interesting people in an attempt to bring you different perspectives that you can use to enrich your mind and improve your life in whatever way you see fit. Today, I'm speaking with author and artist Austin Kleon. Austin, if you don't know who he is the author of two of my favorite books on the creative process, Steal Like an Artist and Show Your Work. And I've spoken about these books numerous times on my blog at thinkorprosper.com. They're in several of my book recommendation lists I have there. And I've shared pages from them on my Instagram page at Think Grow Prosper over the years. And Austin is a super impressive guy. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He has over 1 million copies of his books in print right now. They've been translated into over 24 different languages. He's given talks about creativity in the digital age to huge organizations like Pixar and Google, South by Southwest, TEDx, and many others. And I love his message. His writing resonates with me so much, I think because of how simple and blunt it is and how crystal clear the ideas are. If you are someone who creates anything, whether it's just for your personal enjoyment or for an audience, I would highly recommend his books. They've been really important to me and to my creative process and to my philosophy on producing work, in fact. And for a long time now, I've wanted to have a conversation like this with Austin about some of the more personal aspects of his life and his work, and just kind of pick his brain about some of the questions that have popped up for me as I have read his work. And I got to do that with this conversation, so I'm really excited to share it with you guys. In this episode, we talk about a lot of things. We cover a lot of ground, but one of the main themes we hit on is the importance of play and why it's so vital to producing good work. And I kind of tie that in with this principle I've been talking about of maintaining balance. And so that's a fun conversation. We also talk about his parenting philosophies. I'm a new dad, and actually Austin is the first guest, I believe, that I have spoken with since little baby Ruben has been born. So I couldn't help myself. I had to ask him about some of his parenting philosophies. He's in a similar position as me. I mean, his kids are older, but he works for himself. He works from home. He values creativity and kind of wants to show his kids the value of doing meaningful work. And so I asked him about that, and we kind of talk about that for a while. So I found that pretty interesting. Hopefully some of you will too, even if you don't have kids. I think it's useful and valuable. And then we also talk about his new book, Keep Going, which I'm super excited for. It's a guide to staying creative and inspired in good times and in bad. And he just kind of gives us a little taste for what to expect in that book. So very cool stuff. I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I had a really fun time talking with Austin. We kind of meander at certain parts in the conversation and diverge here and there, but overall, I think you guys will find it super useful and valuable. Austin is a great guy, really genuine dude, and is the same person when the mic is on or off. So I hope we can do this again because I had a blast. Here's Austin Kleon. I like this idea of, you wrote a blog post, you said you're deeply lazy or something like that. And I really like this idea of play, and like how play is important to work.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot. One of my, favorite topics is what the audience perceives of the author versus, who the author actually is. And, one of the things I try to say over and over to my readers is that I am the most helpful, nicest version of myself in the books. so like in my normal life, I mean, I have deficiencies that are great and that I struggle with constantly. And I write these books. A lot of the reason I write these books is because I am struggling with these things. And it's not that I have it all figured out. It's just that I need to figure these things out. And the best way for me to do that is to write about them. And so for when it comes to laziness, I mean, I think sometimes people, they see my output and they see what I've done and they think, oh, he must be like a real go-getter. He must be a real, productivity freak. And the fact of the matter is, I am a deeply lazy person. I mean, I work all the time, but I'm also deeply lazy. And I'm interested in this kind of tension because I love, idleness and doing nothing and sitting around, but yet I'm also like compelled to work all the time. And I have slowly come to this conclusion that I think the two, I think it's because I'm deeply lazy that I'm also compelled to make work. I think my productivity has its roots somehow in my laziness. That the laziness provides meaning to the work. Work without any laziness would be meaningless in a weird way. I don't know how to explain it better, but I think that so much of what I do comes from it doesn't look like I'm doing a lot when it kind of happens, I mean, I think art and creative work, you just have to spend a lot of time doing nothing.
And creating the space for the creativity to kind of come in almost.
Yeah. And you kind of have to sit still a lot and kind of fidget and fumble and putter. I think that I'm concerned about the kind of mania for productivity right now, because if you kind of look in a big picture sense, people have never been more productive. I mean, you can read all the all the reports say that the American worker is doing just as much work as they've ever done, and yet they're seeing fewer rewards. And it doesn't really feel like, we're necessarily getting to be a more thoughtful, kinder, happier people.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
what is this for? What is all this productivity for? And so I'm always thinking about that too. I consider myself a pretty productive person, but I'm also a deeply lazy person. And I think I'm not sure anymore that that's a coincidence.
No, I think that I agree. I think that there is a balance there that's hard to articulate. I've been talking about this kind of in another form to my audience, and it's this. I've been trying to organize life advice, kind of, for lack of a better way to put that, and a lot of so much wisdom that comes at us from so many different fields: self-development, psychology, philosophy, religion, and it's almost overwhelming. So I've been coming up with these categories okay, a lot of advice is pay attention. That's one category. The second category is get clarity. There's a lot contained within that. And then the third one, which is relevant to what you just said, is maintain balance, which is something something like balancing opposing energies or opposing forces to create harmony, and I think that's what you're getting at right there, which is like balancing your laziness, your need to play, which is actually really intrinsic to humans, with productivity and with work, and so I think that's really important, an important thing that you touched on, and you actually said a lot in there that I want to unpack, but I want to kind of come at it from a few different angles. I know that you have two kids now. You have a 6-year-old or 7-year-old and a newborn, right?
I have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old.
Oh, 4-year-old. Okay, God, wow, I'm behind. Well, I just became a new parent.
My condolences. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, man. So he's almost a month old, and so
Oh, wow.
we're super excited, and so now I feel like such a parent because I want to like ask you about parenting stuff, and like I'm immediately going to go for the common ground of kids right now.
Yeah, please do. No, I love talking to. I mean, I love talking to other dads and parents about it. You are in. I mean, you are in the worst of it right now. I mean, like 1 month in is like the euphoria of the birth and the arrival has kind of gone usually, and now you're like, I mean, the sleep and the feeding and like all that. I mean, this is really the roughest time. I'm really impressed that you're even doing an interview.
well, it was an iffy thing to schedule, but he's actually pretty good, and he's sleeping right now with mom. And the audience doesn't know, but we had some technical glitches before starting this conversation, and my wife is the sound engineer, my technician who I go to, and she couldn't come over, and I was just stranded. I was like, oh damn it! So it is a little difficult.
Oh yeah, please tell me you didn't wake her up for this.
No, she was awake, but
Okay,
but the
good.
baby's asleep, and he's still asleep, so that's good.
Okay, good.
But
Never wake a sleeping baby.
yeah, exactly. But I guess what I wanted to ask you about that, like relating to parenting, is you have a really interesting blog post, one that resonated with me, and I think it was called "Love What You Do in Front of the Kids in Your Life."
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and you're just talking about how, like, well, you wrote this. One of the lines that stood out to me, and I wrote this down. It's like, if you spend more time in your life doing the things that you love and that you feel are worthwhile, the kids in your life will get hip to what that looks like. And you really argue for this point in the book. And of course, in the blog post. And of course, this is something that's super important to me. Like, I have worked really hard to cultivate a life that I do what I feel is meaningful work, and I can only hope that for my child. And looking at your social media and some of the things you share on your blog, it seems like you've really done a great job of incorporating kind of your career into your kids' playtime almost. And I'm just wondering how this looks like in your life. Like, what does this look like? How do you do things in front of your kid that you love?
One thing I always try to say is that my life doesn't look like a lot of other people's lives. I mean, and other dads. I mean, I am truly lucky that I get to be home all the time if I'm not on the road. I've just been home ever since my kids were born. And so I've had this really amazing and also, hard, amazing and challenging opportunity to really kind of work around the kids and to have them fully kind of integrated into my life. And I feel like a lot of parents worry about what they should be doing with their kids, or how they should be raising their kids, when I really think that the hardest thing about parenting for me is that you really have to become the type of human being that you want them to become. There's really no way around that hard work unless you're going to outsource it. I think there's great arguments for, having a nanny or sending your kids to daycare. that's like a necessity for a lot of people. And sometimes I think it's better because I think that, sometimes being around your parents all the time is not the best thing, especially if your parents are a couple of nutballs like us. But there are two things I think are the hardest thing about being a parent. The first is what I just said, which is inevitably you come to the conclusion that you have to become the kind of human being. The best way to raise good human beings is to become a whole, well-rounded human being yourself. And that's borderline impossible, So that's the hardest thing. The second thing I would say that's hardest about raising kids is just that they make you vulnerable to your surroundings in a way that is not that never happens when you're just kind of a single person or you're just in a relationship. I mean, the minute you have children, you are vulnerable to your environment in a way that you just never were before. And that to me is the most terrifying and hard part of it because, you can't control things the way that you're just at the mercy of your environment more than you would be as just an adult.
Do you mean like do you mean more vulnerable to like threats or like danger?
It can go all the way from your household to your country to your world. I felt very much like a survivor before I had kids. I was like, well, I can live in a crummy apartment.
Right.
I can live in a crappy neighborhood. I can live in a noisy, crummy city. I can deal with this crazy country that seems hell-bent on murdering their children, really. I mean, in some ways, when you think about our gun policies and our global warming policies and our policies in general, our healthcare, we're not a country that seems real concerned with children. This is nothing new. I mean, this is no new insight, but you just realize how shaped kids are by their environments and just how everyone's a result of their environment. And you just don't for me, I never really latched on to that as much until I had kids. And so one of the things I'm really, really into as a parent is I'm really into this idea that my friend Rob Greco calls your minimum viable utopia. So I'm very interested in turning my house into the kind of environment that I really think is good and decent. And so, I mean, everyone's into making a home for their kids that is good and decent, I think. But I just try as much as I can to let them into my world, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Do you work in front of your kids? Do you make it a point to work in front of your kids?
I this morning, my son Owen is 6 and he goes to a half day kindergarten now. So he doesn't even go to kindergarten until after lunch, and then he's only there for 3 or 4 hours or something. This morning, I brought Owen up to the studio and I wrote in my diary and we listened to music, and he made a bunch of drawings and kind of wrote some of his own stuff. And sometimes, so we'll do stuff like that. Now he's not in here with me now, obviously, but, so I'll just do little things like that. And I'll, when I was working on Keep Going, I would actually ask him what he thought of different ideas. I would test things out on him, and because he's a really early reader, so he can read really well. I'd ask him about a title. There's a comic in the back of the book where he says, and this is really what he says. He's like, don't worry, Papa. I'll ask Siri what we should title the book. But there's also a comic in there where he says, it didn't look like you were working on a book, Papa. It looked like you were working on your computer. Just stuff like that. So
I love that.
So he was really he's a lot like me, and so it's easy for me to kind of have him in the studio. One thing I realized when I was working on this last book is how much I really love having someone else in the room with me. when I work, which is kind
Oh.
of strange for a writer, but
Yeah, that is strange.
I like having like a silent partner in the room, like another body in the room. It's an interesting thing. Like, I don't want anyone to talk to me, and I don't want anyone to like really make noise or bug me. I like having another human in the room. It's
It's like pretend you're not there, but be there.
Yeah.
Be there, but don't be there.
Yeah, it's a strange thing. So if Owen and I can peacefully coexist, like if he's working on his stuff and I'm working on mine, there are brief moments where we can kind of chill. But when I say this, by the way, I mean, this is like maybe an hour at a stretch, before I have to like kick him out or we got to go have lunch or something. But I always try to draw it in front of them and like keep a notebook in front of them. And I try really hard to like read books on paper and not like on a Kindle or my phone, because I have wanted them from the beginning to like see us reading books, and because that's something we really value in our house. I'm always playing music in front of them, like, so I'll play records for them, but then I'll also like play piano in front of them, play guitar. Owen and I do a lot of recording together, so he really loves GarageBand on his iPad. So we'll like,
nice.
Yeah, so we have like a little mini studio in the house that we'll go to and like kind of play together. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, so it's just like, for me, it's really about, it's about sharing what I love with the kids, but it's also about like finding the Venn diagram overlap of what they naturally seem to be interested in and what I'm naturally interested in, and not trying to like chisel them into some image of myself, but to like figure out what it is that we share an affinity for, and to spend time on that.
Yeah, that's kind of been my thinking also. Like, there's a temptation to just want them to do all the same things you do and like all the same things you like, but I think in practice what it's about is really just exposing your kids to as many ideas and activities and kind of fields as possible, and letting them kind of see that and then choose for themselves what's important to them, what's meaningful to them. And I think that your example is the primary way that they navigate that. It's like, oh, dad's working on things that are meaningful to him, and then they can find what it is that's meaningful to them. And I'm fortunate enough to be in a similar position as you, where I've been at home since little Ruben was born, and and I will be, hopefully, for the remainder of his life. I'm a stay-at-home dad. I work from home and everything, and so I'm really interested in how other parents approach that. Like, how do you kind of, because most parents go off to work,
Yeah.
and so now I'm working here at the house, and so what does that look like for me and for our lifestyle? So I really liked what you said there.
Yeah, and I will say one other thing. Like, I think a lot of dads, I think in the culture, dads, when they think about having kids, they immediately think about all the wisdom they're going to impart to them.
right.
I'm going to teach him how to like ride a bike and how to hit a baseball and like all this stuff. And
I'm guilty of that for sure.
I actually, when I had kids, I really had this deep feeling that they were going to teach me more than I ever did for them. And I slowly came around to the realization that I wasn't going to think of myself as a teacher. What I was going to think of myself as is a librarian. And what I mean by that is, like, when that was one of my first jobs when I was out of college. I used to work the reference desk, and librarians are a little bit different than teachers, or at least teachers in our kind of American, like, compulsory schooling type vision of teaching, which is like, there are things that kids need to know, and we have lesson plans, and like the job is to impart is to get them to know these things. Like that's kind of our cartoon version of what a teacher does. And I love teachers to death and I think the world of them. But in the world of school, like that's what a teacher's supposed to do. He or she is supposed to get them to know these things, and I think a librarian is strikingly different than that model. A librarian creates spaces in which people can learn whatever they want to learn. So a librarian is there as a resource. And so when I think about my kids at home, what my wife and I are trying to do is we're trying to create environments in which they can learn things, whatever they want to. And for me, it seems small, but the less I think of myself as a teacher and the more I think of myself as a librarian, the better a parent I find myself being, because I don't have any kind of set lesson plan. I don't have any kind of results that I need to see out of my kids. I'm more like I'm just providing the space for them to grow and to learn and to become who they are going to be. And if you think about that, doesn't mean there aren't any rules. I mean, there are plenty of rules in the library. There are rules you have to follow and there are ways of being in the library, but everything else is kind of up to you. That to me has been a really helpful mental framework for my parenting. And, the thing I want to say is like, I do not consider myself a good dad at all. I mean, the bar is so low for dads that I think I'm pretty decent when you consider the average. I mean, but like right. Everything is aspirational, and I fail every day. Every day I fail, whether it's, yelling or whether it's losing my temper or just bungling every situation. I mean, parenting will humble you in a way that's indescribable, really. But the more I parent like a librarian, the better off I kind of am as a person.
Yeah, I love that. It is true that librarians, they are able to expose people to the most amount of information. And so that's a good way to look at your job as a dad, I think.
And it's important to remember now that librarians actually, it is about information, but it's also so much of what a public librarian does now is create spaces. Like every great library system now, and I've visited a lot of them through speaking, and I'm also what I call a library tourist. I always like to visit libraries when I'm in new cities, and a lot of libraries now, they have like maker spaces, and they have like 3D printers, and they have like laser cutting, and like I visited an amazing library in Chattanooga that had a recording studio that they let people check out, So like libraries have really become like this kind of amazing, they're like spaces more than, I mean, in some ways they're still about getting people in touch with information, but they also, they host events and they run workshops and they do a lot more than just like put people in touch with information that they need, And so it's really...
Yeah, it's like an intellectual jungle gym.
It really is. I mean, and if you think of a good children's section in a library, like a lot of really great children's sections, they not only have like books and computers and stuff, but they'll have toys, And there are toys for adults in a lot of libraries. So it's been really illuminating to. I've felt really lucky to have my librarian background and to visit so many libraries over the years, because it's really influenced me a lot.
On this show, I often focus on the mental and emotional aspects of living well. But physical health is just as important. You can't think, grow, or prosper to the fullest unless you have your health in check. 4 Sigmatic products have really helped me with this part of my life. There are very few companies whose products I recommend without reservation, but Four Sigmatic is definitely one of them. I've been using their superfood supplements for years, long before they became a sponsor of this podcast. Four Sigmatic specializes in mushroom-based drinks that promote immunity, energy, longevity, and just help us live all-around healthier lives. As far as what I'd recommend, they make a wide variety of different blends, but there's two that I'll recommend to you. The first is their Coffee with Cordyceps blend. Cordyceps is a medicinal mushroom, and it's been shown to support energy, stamina, and athletic performance, so it's perfect before a workout or during a study session or anytime you need some extra focus. And all their coffee is 100% organic, and it actually tastes like coffee, not like mushrooms in case you were worried. The second product I'll recommend is probably my favorite supplement I've taken in a very long time. It's not a coffee blend, it's actually a blend of 10 different adaptogenic herbs. What are adaptogenic herbs? In a nutshell, they are plants that have been traditionally consumed, often for thousands of years, to help people adapt to various forms of stress. They help minimize fatigue, promote focus, and just increase general well-being. So I've been mixing this blend into my morning smoothies for a while now, and I've been amazed by how balanced it makes me feel. Cognitively, I'm sharper, I can work for longer periods of time, and I just generally have more energy. As a listener of the Think Grow podcast, you can get 15% off any Four Sigmatic purchase by going to foursigmatic.com/TGP. They've also been kind enough to set up a discount code for you guys. So just type in the letters TGP, as in Think Grow Prosper, at checkout, and you'll get 15% off your order. So again, that URL you want to visit for the discount is foursigmatic.com, all spelled out, /TGP. Or just use discount code TGP at checkout to get 15% off your order. And now, back to the show. Coming back to kind of the play aspect of this, because I really am interested in that, and I want to know a little bit more about how you view play. Does I know you've kind of written posts on blurring the line between work and play, and I want to know more about that, because one could like delude themselves into thinking that they're working when they're actually playing, and so you could take it too far potentially. But I'm wondering, like, do you have boundaries there? Like, do your children know when you're working and when you're playing, or do they think what you do is all play?
No, that's interesting. I don't know. I'd have to ask them. I do know that my son Owen has a very distorted view of publishing. I mean, Owen really thinks that, like, oh, if you need some money, you just write a book, or if it's easy to just kind of. He's got a very, and I like that actually. I love that it's distorted right now, because he feels like Owen right now feels that, like, he can make a movie, he can, like, write an album, he can, like, do a zine, he can make a book. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, he can do all that stuff, and so that I like his. I don't want to take away any of that from him, but my thing about play and work is just that, I mean, they're really opposites. I mean, they are, when you get right down to it, like, play is not about results.
But it sometimes leads to results, though, don't you think?
Well, of course it does. But if you start out hoping for a result from play, it gets very frustrating. And so I think as a creative person, it's really important to have times in your day that are results free. You know how, like, Google has, like, I think it's Google and, like, a couple of other companies, they have results only work environments, or results oriented work environments, or whatever, like, where you don't necessarily have to clock in or clock out. It's all about the results. Artists almost need the opposite of that. Like, they need results optional workplaces. I almost think of it as like R&D or something for art. I mean, you need time.
Yeah.
You need time to, like, futz around with stuff, and you might get something great or you might get something garbage. Like that has to kind of be built into the day. Otherwise, you're just not really doing the exploratory work that I consider like art or real kind of raw creative stuff.
You just said that you're describing play, and then you said you described it as exploratory work.
Oh
And so
yeah,
that kind of
that's
like
interesting.
blurred a little bit of the line there, you know?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, play is the work of the child. Like Maria Montessori said that. And I also think it's the work of the artist. But it's different than like a game, you know, play and games are different and there's just so many different levels, but I have to have a time in the day if I'm going to truly have a good productive work day, I have got to have scheduled playtime. Like there's got to be time where I push pixels around in Photoshop or I scribble in my notebook or I draw on a, you know, pad without any kind of like result, like without hoping for any kind of determined result. Like when I'm going to do a blog post and I open the WordPress screen on my computer, like there's this kind of like uncertainty about where it's going to go to the writing process, you know? And even that I consider to be like kind of a form of play. I think kids help you figure out what play is too, because, you know, if you watch a kid play with blocks, it's such a great experience because I think when people hear the term play, they think that it's all fun. And it's like, no, actually, fun is different than play. Like, play can be really serious. And children get really upset when they play. Like, they can get really frustrated.
If they can't do something.
Yeah. I mean, if play can be incredibly frustrating for a kid.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I guess my own opinion of play is just that like it has to be a crucial, and this gets back to what we were talking about with productivity, is like you have to have days as a creative person where you take the risk that you might not have anything to show for it at the end of the day.
Yeah.
That is the gamble you take with playing, is that you might make something great or you might have something that you have to scrap, you know? And that's just like, that's the nature of the work. To use that word again.
It's kind of like being unattached to the outcome to a degree. It's like you're kind of process oriented. How do you know when you're playing too much and not working enough? Like, how do you maintain that balance?
For me, like deadlines are just crucial. Like I just have to have deadlines. So like when I sign a book contract and there are dates that have to be met, that's crucial for me. I have little deadlines for myself every day. So like I try to post a blog post every day, and even at 11:59 p.m. that works. Like that's fine. I just try to post like at least one thing every day. And then every week I have a weekly newsletter that has to be done. And so those are kind of like, if I hit, as far as my work goes, I have a couple of things with my own practice. It's like, if I fill out my diary in the morning, like I diary really kind of like 3 to 5 pages every day, handwritten in a notebook. If I do that, and if I do a blog post, and then like the day is a success, basically, because what I've done is I've put a little drop in the bucket, so to speak. Like John McPhee talks about how, like, you know, he feels really unproductive, but most days, but if you put a drop in the bucket, eventually you get like a pint. The diary and the blog posts those are drops in the bucket. And as long, so like on a daily basis, if I do those two things, like, and that's bare minimum. Like if I do that, like that was a decent work day. And then if I, each week, if I put out a good newsletter, like that's a good marker. And then, you know, if I'm working on a book or something, I mean, I have all kinds of like weird, you know, I've got word count that I try to write to,
milestones,
and that kind of thing. Yeah, exactly.
That's a good point. So like basically you incorporate structure also into your play, because that's kind of the other side of play also. That's something that helps balance it, I think, is structure and also restriction, I think. And you write about this too, and this is something that I'm really interested in as well, which is like thinking that you can do anything at any point often paralyzes you, and restriction helps to cultivate freedom to a degree. And I think that structure, in a way, is a form of restriction. Would you say?
Yeah, I like the word constraint. I mean, I think that a lot of creative work comes from constraints. It comes from, can I take a marker and a piece of newspaper and make a poem? Can I record an album using GarageBand? I think creativity without constraints is borderline impossible. I mean, because for me, like, part of it is simply taking what's in front of you and turning it into something new. I mean, that's like my basic definition of creativity, is just like taking what's in front of you and maybe what's in front of everyone else and just like turning it into something new. Constraints also help you. The more constrained you can make your work, like it's also helps you get started, So if you're just like, let me see if I can say what I'm going to say in 200 words or something, I mean.
Yeah, I remember the first experience I had with that in my own life was when I was in second grade. And of course I didn't consciously recognize it at the time as this, but it was, I had broken my hand and I had a cast on my right hand. I'm right-handed, and we were drawing. We were like doing art time and we were drawing, and I was like, oh, I'm not going to be able to do it. I'm not going to be able to write, because I had my fingers were exposed, but my cast was coming up to about mid finger, and so what I had to do was I had to grip the pencil in a really odd way, like in a very weird way that I'd never done before. And I was like, there's no way I'm going to be able to do it. But I like drew the best lion I had ever drawn ever. Like, it was perfect. It was better than anyone in the class, at least by my standards, And I surprised myself. And then, like, only recently have I looked back on that experience and I was like, oh, wow, I like restricted myself in some weird way. And I ended up like having to try harder, and that somehow forced me to be more creative.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting that you brought that up, because I actually keep a long file of artists whose kind of signature work came from some sort of physical shortcoming. The examples that pop to mind right away are cartoonists tend to be. It's strange how many cartoonists have a lazy eye, like one of their eyes doesn't work.
Really?
Yeah, like Charles Schultz, Art Spiegelman, both of them suffered from, I think it's called amblyopia or something like that, where, one of the eyes doesn't function correctly. And what that does is you have to look out of one eye, and that flattens the world. I think it's interesting that like those two great cartoonists, had this like eye disorder. I think Art Spiegelman's written about how like his lack of depth perception helps him kind of render the world in 2D. But there's fun stories in music, like Tommy Iommi of Black Sabbath lost a couple of fingers in an industrial accident. And so he like fitted his fingertips with these like leather little like thimbles, and then he detuned the strings on his guitar, so they were more. It was easier to bend the strings.
Huh.
And anyone who's played guitar knows that when you detune your strings, you start getting this like more sludgy sound, and so a lot of that Black Sabbath sound is due to the way that he detuned his strings. That was partly, to help him play. And then, like, you've got Regina Spektor, who has tiny hands. She wanted to be a classical pianist, but, like, if you're going to perform, like, you have to have pretty big hands to do like Rachmaninoff and stuff like that. So she actually quit classical music, and that's when she started pop music.
Wow.
Yeah, like Chuck Close, the painter, he can't recognize faces. And so he...
What? I've heard of that condition before. That's crazy.
Yeah, so he's a portrait painter, and so a lot of his style of portrait painting comes from the fact that he can't recognize faces. Saul Steinberg said that what we respect in the artist is always their battle against their limitations.
Oh, dude, I have that quote. You have that quote in your book in Steal Like an Artist, and I have one of those letterboard things that you put like the letters on the board, and I have that quote. I'm staring at it right now. It's right above my desk. What we respond to in any work of art is the artist's struggle against his or her own limitations. I love that quote.
Send me a picture of that. I would love to have a picture of that. Yeah, but that's kind of how it goes, and that should be liberating for young artists and artists who are starting out, or just artists and creative people in general. Is that it is to borrow the title of Ryan Holiday's book, "The Obstacle is the Way."
Exactly
the very thing that you struggle with in your life will be the thing that leads to some of your best work.
Such a paradox still, but it's so true. It's so profoundly true, and it shows up in so many different ways. So I'm really glad you touched on that.
It's the same thing that we were talking about before when I said that people think that authors write books because they know all this stuff, and I think that for me personally, like, I write books about what I struggle with. That's why they are what they are.
That is one of the things that I really have to remind myself of daily, especially because like it's so tempting on social media to get sucked into what people are responding to and pander to that.
Sure.
And so it's so, Tim Ferriss one time, he said something like, creativity by consensus is, leads to a sure death or something like that. And it's like so true. You really have to write about, and well, I mean, you say it in your book. It's like, write the book you want to read, play the music you want to hear. Like, that is so true. And that's something that I think about daily is reminding myself, like, do it for you, like, write what it is that you want to hear about, not what it is that you think other people might want to hear from you. And I think that's an important point.
This is a big thing right now because I feel that social media, there's so much feedback that you can get through social media. A lot of the feedback you get on social media is not qualitative, it's quantitative. Like, you can see how many people pressed a heart, or you can see like how many people like retweeted something. It's interesting to me how little I see a correlation between work that I think is actually interesting and really good and what people like. I think that people like, for example, like on Instagram, people like what's easily digested and what's easy to read.
Yeah.
It's so dangerous online. I remember years ago, I had a painter friend who just refused to put his work on the internet. And this is right around the time I wrote my book, Show Your Work. So he was almost like a test case for me. He was someone I was trying to reach. And his perspective was, I don't want to put my work on the internet because I'm worried that I'll start making work for the internet. And I thought he was crazy at the time. But man, now I think there was a lot of wisdom there, because social media, what flies on there is not necessarily what's good or lasting or whatever. It's what works on that platform. And that is as a creative person, that is something to deal with. And that is something that you have to keep in mind. And, the numbers can be bewitching, and they can also be, they can lead you down weird paths. Now, that said, I don't necessarily know that we're always the best judge of, what we do. A lot of artists I know are not the best judges of their work. And that's why it's so important in your life to have trusted editors and trusted readers and people that you really respect, who you want to impress.
Yeah.
So that's like such an important thing versus, what gets you the numbers on social media. Social media at a certain point becomes kind of boring, in that you just know like what people are going to respond to. It's going to be what's, it's just going to be, and the tension for a creative person or someone who really wants to push with their work is just like, how do I balance being online and serving up things that, you want people to like your stuff and you want people to share it, but you also want to push them and you want to, you want to actually push yourself. And I can tell you for sure that some of the stuff that I've done recently that I felt like really kind of was new for me and led me in a new interesting direction wasn't necessarily the thing that got like thousands of likes.
There is some aspect of social media, like I want to give the devil his due a little bit, like, well, okay, for instance, maybe this isn't a perfect analogy because this was not social media, but a website. Like your blog, you had a blog post, right, that inspired your first book, Steal Like an Artist, and it kind of went viral.
Mm-hmm.
And based on that, you kind of morphed into a book. So there's like some aspect of people voting for your work that makes you go, oh, maybe this resonates with some people. Maybe I should carry this further. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great measure. I mean, it can be. But I just think everyone's so distracted. It's not that people are stupid. They're just distracted right now. I mean, people are really busy and they're really distracted. And when they pick up their phones, which is primarily how they interact with social media, they just don't, how you look at stuff online. It's just like it needs to be immediately
Scrolling.
Yeah, it needs to be immediately recognizable. It needs to hit and it needs to give you like a little bit of like a dopamine hit, and then you fave it and you move on. So you just have to like balance. I don't know any way around this other than like it has never been easier in some ways and it's never been harder. Like it's never been easier to amass an audience. It's never been harder to do actually great work and get an audience. It's easier and it's hard.
Yeah.
Because it's just to cut through the noise and to do anything subtle or to do anything like different or weird or push things. It's just
Or nuanced.
yeah, it's really difficult right now. I mean, and that's true in every aspect of American life right now. Like even like especially with politics. Like where is the where is the measured kind of subtle, thoughtful discourse in our culture?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
who's providing that right now? It's the loudest, the dumbest, the ugliest that kind of rises to the top, and it's frustrating and it's disheartening. But I will say that what I find beautiful right now is that there's an appetite now for things that aren't. I find that the rise of email newsletters to be very interesting to me because people are really longing for like just a quieter, more personal form of media to hear from people. So like I think the rise of the email newsletter is really heartening. I am really heartened that people still read my blog, that people go there and they know that like there's no comments, there's no pop-up ads, there's nothing.
Do you remove comments deliberately?
Yeah, I don't do comments on my blog.
Why is that? Just if I may ask.
I don't care. I don't care what anyone has to say about it. I figure that if it's my site and I think that if you have a comment box, you invite comments. And I really don't want people to have a say on my site anymore. Like it's for me. And if you want to comment, you can send me an email. You can post about it on your own site, but you're not invited to leave your thoughts on my site. There was a time that comment sections were kind of cool and healthy, and there are even still some comment sections I think online that are overall really great. Like my wife reads a site called Go Fug Yourself, which is like a kind of like, I think it's like a style like kind of gossip site, but she also gets like a lot of her book recommendations from the comments on that blog. And there's still like a really good scene on that website. And I haven't read that site in a while, but it used to be really great. And My wife still loves it. So it's still a possibility. But for me personally, like, one, I just don't care if people want to talk to me. Like, they know how they can talk to me, and then two is just kind of like, I don't want to spend all day moderating. And I don't want, people say enough nasty things online. I don't need an email every time someone leaves a comment on my blog.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I think that, all this stuff is personal. And that's something that I really, I'm always like pushing people, like, look, however you're comfortable operating online, that's how you should operate.
You mentioned that going back to a thread that we had a little earlier, you mentioned that you schedule play into your day. I was wondering if you could give kind of like a rough, I know this is kind of somewhat of an annoying question sometimes, but I'm really interested because I'm, as a fellow writer, I would say, I want to know what a typical work day looks like for you. Like, when do you schedule the like play? Do you schedule in long blocks or short blocks when you write? What time of the day, like that kind of a thing. Just kind of a rough outline of what a typical workday looks like for you. Or maybe there's no typical workday. Maybe it's just kind of like fly by the seat of your pants.
It's pretty loosey-goosey right now just because, like, I'm about to go on this gigantic tour that's going to take like 2 months, and I'm ramping up for this book release. So there's so much admin to be done. Like, there's so much travel arrangements, and there's interviews to do and things to book that I'm not working the way I would work like if I was working on a book. So
Got it.
Routines are aspirational. There always are. But I would say, in a general sense, generally I adhere to what John Waters says, the filmmaker, about what he does. Is he says, I make things up in the morning and they sell them in the afternoon. For me, what that looks like is the majority of my creative work I schedule in the morning. That's when I write my journal. That's when I do blog posts mostly. And that's when I do any kind of like really kind of more juicy, hard creative stuff. And then in the afternoon, it's like emails. And if I do like a podcast like we're doing right now, or even paying bills, or, whatever, I save that stuff for the afternoon. And then evenings are about reading and loitering and being idle and just relaxing mostly.
Recharging.
Yeah, exactly. There are days in the afternoon where if I don't have much going on, I'll just read all afternoon, because that's primarily my job. I mean, as a writer, I feel like at least half of the job is reading.
Yeah, you write about that, and if we have time, I want to talk to you more about that because I have some questions about that. But I wanted to touch on your book, actually, because you mentioned you're going on this big tour.
Yeah.
And you have this new book coming out, Keep Going, which I'm very excited about. I'm a huge fan of your previous books, Steal Like an Artist and Show Your Work. I've talked about them on podcasts before. I've shared them on my social media, and I want to know, like, what led to this book and what inspired you to write this book, and why did you feel it was an important thing to write?
A couple of years ago, I felt like it really felt like the world was burning, and I would wake up every morning and check my phone, and I just feel like we'd all gotten dumber and meaner overnight. And I really watched a lot of my creative friends just like lose it. Kind of everyone was just kind of losing their minds. And I felt like everyone was, we're sort of going through this moment in the country where like things are just so ramped up politically, and it's just such a nightmare. And then social media and technology have just like frazzled us to the max now. So we're just like this angry, distracted culture right now. And so there was that. I just felt like I watched a lot of myself and a lot of the creative people I know. It felt like they were really like kind of getting off the path. And then a lot of the creative people I know were just having, in general, problems with just sustaining your career. Just like a lot of my friends, we've been doing it for a while, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe 15, 20 years. But there is to sustain a creative career over a long haul it's a tough thing. And so I just felt like I needed some sort of guide. I needed some sort of corrective. I needed like something like a pep talk, really, to keep me on track. And that's really where Keep Going got started. And it was just built out of things that kind of worked for me and seemed to work for others. And that's where it happened. And it's kind of the first book that I've written because I wanted to read it. Like the first, and I see it as the third in a trilogy with Steal Like an Artist and Show Your Work. But Steal Like an Artist was a talk that then became a blog post that then became a book. And I was asked to give the talk, and I was asked if I wanted to do the book. So it was kind of like that was also written for like that book was written for like a previous version of myself, a younger, dumber, just starting out person. And then Show Your Work was a book that was written directly in response to my readers, because the primary thing that I got asked on the road and like online after Still Like an Artist came out and it was a success was like, how do you do this? Like, how did you do this? Like, how did you become who you are? Like, how did you get your stuff out there? Like, how do you get published and self-promote and all that stuff? And then, so Keep Going is kind of like the first book. It's also, there's a big 5-year gap in between Show Your Work and Keep Going. So I had kids, I was further on in my career. And so I think Keep Going is a book that encourages people it has things that you can do immediately to kind of stop the bleeding, so to speak. It's got stuff in there that like I think will make your days better immediately. But it also encourages you to think in the long term in a way that I think is like that creative people aren't really encouraged to do a lot these days. And so that was really my hope for the book, that it would provide like a pep talk for people in the immediate short term, and then would also inspire them with principles that would kind of keep them going throughout their career. That was a really long answer.
No, that was perfect. Actually, that summed it up perfectly. Is it primarily for creatives?
It was written for writers and artists and creative people, but I think this is the book more than any of my other books that will kind of resonate no matter what you do, because it's really a book more about like integrating your life and your creativity and just kind of overcoming, kind of like making a creative life for yourself. It's a little bit more about like establishing a life against the noise of the wider world and doing meaningful work and meaningful play and that kind of thing. And so I think it, for sure, I would hope that people who don't consider themselves creative would read it. And I think it's more applicable because there's just like sort of some more general life advice in there, getting out and walking and tidying up and like, and then, paying attention to your everyday world and trimming your internet use and all that kind of stuff. And that's the kind of stuff that I think can benefit anyone in any profession.
Yeah, one of my favorite principles. By the way, I love how you lay out your books because they're very orderly, and it's very easy to see kind of where it's going and to pop into any chapter and extract some wisdom. And then, if you want, close the book and come back and pop into another chapter. So I love the way you lay it out. And there's like, I don't know, 10 principles, I think.
Yeah.
Feel Like an Artist, there's 10 principles. And Show Your Work, there's 10 also. And is there 10 also in Keep Going?
Yeah, there's 10 and Keep Going. Just a nice round number. 10 commandments, 10 principles.
Right. And I love the first one, which is, I think it's like every day is Groundhog's Day.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what you mean by that?
That chapter was about my struggles with the term creative journey, because I feel like when people talk about the creative journey, I never really felt like I was on a creative journey. Like I just felt like a journey implies that there's some sort of destination. The only creative journey I really feel like I go on is like the walk to and from my studio. you know but I needed some sort of metaphor. I needed some sort of cultural artifact to talk about what I see as the kind of endless cycle of kind of repetition, the kind of repetitious cycle of days that happens for a creative person. Because I think in creative work, more than any other kind of work, you're like, particularly as a writer, every day you just like have to stare at a blank page. So you can just kind of like, every day is a blank page in a sense. And I think that no matter where you are in your creative career, that question, what's next, comes like no matter where you are. And so you're always coming back to like a new starting point with every project. And so I needed some sort of Groundhog Day, the movie with Bill Murray, presented itself as, I thought, a terrific parable for what the creative artist kind of goes through. And I just wanted to start the book with that. I just thought it really kind of got things off to a good start.
The essence for me was like, just focus on the day and don't worry about the past or present.
Yeah.
In a way, it's kind of applying the dictum, like stay in the now to your career, to your art, kind of. It's like, focus on what you're doing now and just take it day by day.
Yeah, like creative people and all of us find ourselves in a world that we really don't have any control over. I mean, we all that we can control is our own actions and kind of like what we do in our days. And I think Phil finds himself in this place that's completely out of his control, really. And the more he tries to control it, sort of the worse things end up for him. Eventually, spoiler alert for people who haven't seen the movie, he kind of, he turns inwards, and he starts doing things that are kind of intrinsically valuable. Like, it hit me when I was watching the movie, like how he learns he takes on these creative sort of never-ending activities, like he starts reading a lot. He starts playing the piano. He learns to ice sculpt. He does all these like really creative things. And it just seemed right somehow. But I think you're right. Like, I think that no matter where you are in your creative career, you're just going to have to get up tomorrow and work again. And so the more you can think about your days and like what your daily practice is, the more like a daily routine or a daily practice will like pull you through your career. You never really have to worry about what's next because what's next. You're going to go to your studio tomorrow and you're going to work. And you're going to do that until you die. David Hockney, the painter David Hockney, was a big influence on me when I was writing this book, because he would say, I'm going to go on until I fall over. What he does is he just gets up every day and he paints or he draws or whatever, and it's just like there's no question of what he's going to do. Those are the kind of people I was looking for as models in the book, because these people who just they practice what it is that they do every day, and that's pulled them through their lifetime.
Yeah, and it gives you a sense of certainty and direction also, I think, which is important.
Yeah, I mean, I think it gives you some sort of control over your life. I mean, your day, if you're sort of in control of your day, then you're sort of in control of your life in a certain way. Like, what you can control is like when and how hard you work. And then when you want to be out of control is when you're actually doing the work, like you want to let yourself go a little bit when you're like in the actual process. So I don't know. It's interesting. The kind of issues of surrender and control in the artist's work. Brian Eno writes about that really beautifully.
Who's that author you just mentioned?
Brian Eno is a music producer.
Oh, okay.
And he's worked with Talking Heads and U2 and lots of different bands, and also produced a lot of work on his own. But he writes in some of his lectures about how much of art is about surrender versus control, and he's always a fascinating person to listen to.
I love that. Austin, there's so much more I want to talk with you about. I want to be respectful of your time. Hopefully we can do this again at some point in in the future, man, because you touched on a lot of different things that I'm like, oh, I want to go down that rabbit hole. So maybe around your next book or something like that.
Yeah, maybe that would be great. Well, it was fun talking to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Hey, thanks for listening. You can find the show notes for this episode and all other episodes on my website at thinkgrowprosper.com/podcast. That's where I put all the links and resources mentioned in each episode. It's also where I put the outlines of topics covered, which is a really good way to refer back to episodes in the future. Lastly, if you enjoyed this episode, I'd love to hear about it. Feel free to leave a review on iTunes with your biggest takeaway. I make it a point to read all the reviews. You can also screenshot this episode and share it to your social media along with something you learned or found interesting. And tag me in your post because I'd love to see what you found interesting. Say hi and thank you for your support.